As Zimbabwe's general election draws near, there is huge interest in its conduct and outcome. Stakes are high as opposition parties attempt to unseat the governing Zanu-PF that has been in power since the country's independence in 1980. One of the parties contesting the elections is the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe, whose leader Robert Chapman now joins me live from Tennessee in the United States to talk about their ambitions. Mr. Chapman, very good evening. Appreciate your time on Africa Today. The campaign trail is never easy, never mind Zimbabwe. How's it looking for you at the moment?
Things are looking very well. First, let me say thank you for having me on your show, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. You know, right now with the elections looming just ahead of us, anywhere between 90 to 100 days or so, things are looking very well for us on with the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe.
Well, the one thing I want to touch on is a rural voter, and Zanu-PF has won most elections because of their ability to speak to the rural constituency. How have you fared in speaking to them or getting them to listen to your mandate or your proposed mandate?
That's a very good question, and yes, they have. They have really captured the rural voter for quite some time. That has changed as more people get access to information through mobile devices and data. Before, it really relied on sort of structures and cells that were there, but even at some point, would even use different tactics, whether it was, essentially we would classify it maybe as vote buying, sort of gifting to the rural community, and in some cases even using, village heads of village structures to ensure that they were voting a certain direction. Today, we're finding the rural voters more independent because they have access to information. A big part of that has also been a result of a growing diaspora, which is unfortunate for Zimbabwe, where a lot of youth are leaving the country and they're traveling overseas. But because the remittances are so large coming back into the country, they're communicating with their relatives on the ground when they're communicating, the information to pick up funds. So the access to information is growing in the country, which now allows independent thought process for voters. So in all the rural communities that we have visited, it has been extremely welcoming when we have arrived into those communities. So it's been welcoming. Still a lot of work to be done there because of the stronghold that exists, but it has been extremely welcoming, and we can see the tides shifting there.
Now, what's the level of? Well, let's talk about the number of communities, rural communities that you've been to. Certainly, in conversations that we've had, and certainly a lot of the information that we're picking up from the media, parties such as CCC, the MDC, that have been in Zimbabwean politics much longer than you, have found it extremely difficult to get to the rural voter, if at all.
Yes, and it is challenging in the rural communities. There's a lot of them, and you could be just traveling from one major city to another and easily make 15, 20 stops. Now, you can't just do that. You can't just show up, and there's some things in place, whether you look at that as making it difficult for opposition to go into some of these communities. But there are some traditional things that in some cases are required permission to go in and speak with these rural voters. So there is a process that sometimes makes it easy for you, and sometimes that don't make it viable for you. For us, we've visited quite a good bit. The opposition, as you've mentioned, the two that you've mentioned, have been also going into those rural communities, but they're tricky and they differ from region to region, place to place, really depending on the leadership that exists there. So if they say no, or they tell their communities not to talk to you or not to engage in dialogue with you, it becomes a little bit more challenging. But like I said today, with access to information, things like WhatsApp and many other platforms, a lot of them now have access to cell phones and social media. We are talking to them in some of those communities, and we can even see that online. They'll ask, when are you coming to my community? But sometimes it's not just as easy or simple as just going in. You sort of have to follow a certain protocol with that community for them to say, yes, you can come and talk to us.
Well, it's certainly a lot more difficult than you make it sound, but I would like us to watch a clip that I think was part of your campaign, and then we'll come back to a number of questions in a moment. Let's take a look.
Here's a street I grew up on over 30 years ago, and I'm back here. I've been coming back the entire time, and the street has not changed. Nothing has changed. When we ask the question of prosperity, Is there progress? Do you have independent prosperity? And what is that definition to you? But when I see underdevelopment or a standstill society, then I know that we're not feeling prosperous. And I bet you're not as well. This is the street I grew up on. Nothing has changed. There's not been tarred. The only thing that's changed is neighbors have become more secluded. People don't interact as much as they used to back in the past. And what they spend more time doing is taking a look and making sure that they're finding ways to remain prosperous. So I leave you with the question again. Do you feel prosperous?
And that's the million-dollar question. Do you feel prosperous? Talk to us about where did you grow up and where is that street?
Great. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing that video. You know, I grew up in Chinoy, and that's in the location of Chinoy. You know, during segregation, this is where the black Zimbabweans would be placed. So I grew up there with my grandparents, and that road has not changed. That entire community has not changed since I've been there. In fact, some of the neighbors are still the same. They're still the same neighbors that are there when I was growing up as a young man, as a young boy. And so when we talk about, you know, prosperity in Zimbabwe, and we're talking about it through the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe, we're not just talking about national prosperity. We're also talking about independent prosperity. People. Do people have access to jobs, good paying jobs? You know, do you have running water that comes through your community? You know, are you able to put your children through school? This is the first week back, and a lot of parents are already struggling, of course, struggling to pay their school fees because the earned income is very, very challenging. You find the informal sector, especially in that town, in my town in Chinoy, is becoming the bigger part of the economy. You even see that through the country. I believe it's around 82% of the country economy is based on the informal sector. And so that means people are standing on the side of a road, maybe have college degrees, university degrees, or great technical skills, but there's nowhere to apply them. So when we think about prosperity, we're talking about it in every aspect. You know, in that video I also mentioned that people really started building walls up, and we're not really interacting or becoming more, say, a village or a community that we used to. And it's because the politics also becomes polarized. Some people don't want to talk about politics or even share their political affiliations that are there. And some people just really, you know, down on their luck. And it's easy for them just to stay in and focus on their own family. So prosperity-wise, nothing has changed there. In fact, it's regressed. It's gone backwards. But that street is exactly what it looked like, you know, 30 years ago when I was a young boy running through on those streets and playing soccer with my friends and neighbors. That's exactly what it looks like today.
Well, Mr. Chapman, that's probably one of the more fortunate streets in Zimbabwe that hasn't changed, because the majority of streets that had tarred roads no longer have tars. They're riddled with potholes. And in building up to this interview, you know, many questions came through on our social media. And many people said, let's talk to Mr. Chapman about relatability, right? You don't sound Zimbabwean, for a start. And I think relatability is a big part of what Zimbabweans are looking for. How much time have you spent in Zimbabwe in the recent past, I suppose, would be my first question. And secondly, do you think you as an individual are relatable to the typical or the average Zimbabwean?
Yes, and great question. You know, the straight answer to that is yes. I do believe that I am relatable. As we were traveling the country, that question came up, and typically posed from other opposition parties as a way of sort of discrediting. But I am born in Zimbabwe. I was born and raised there. I was born and raised on that very street in that location. People know me. I went to primary school, high school. I was a cricket captain at Chinoy High School when I was there. So people do know me. They know my family. Now, my accent would just demonstrate that I have traveled. I have lived outside the country. And there are many Zimbabweans that sound very different than, I don't know what a Zimbabwean accent would sound like. But Zimbabweans are all over the world. There's Zimbabweans that live in South Africa that probably sound more South African than they do Zimbabwean. But it doesn't change the fact that, one, is we speak the local language, we have family ties there, and we continue to find ways to try and develop and build up our country. How much time have I spent in the country? Quite a lot, to be honest with you. Of course, COVID impeded on travel for many people around the world. But even just this year, I've been to Zimbabwe multiple times. Prior to that, I've been in and out of Zimbabwe quite a good bit, to the point where almost every other month. So I have visited Zimbabwe quite a good bit. I've traveled the country a great extent, as we were obviously putting in our teams and building our structures across the country for the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe. This was before the press conference and the announcement, and then, of course, post that as well, where it was more public that I was traveling. But I do speak my local language, which is Shona, there, and I've addressed public gatherings in, where I'm speaking. That's all I'm speaking is Shona as I'm addressing to the folks on the ground in the communities we go to. So I'm just as Zimbabwean as anybody else. Just because maybe I sound a little bit different or I'm mixed race or anything of that nature doesn't make me any less Zimbabwean. I'm just as Zimbabwean as anyone else. And I grew up very underprivileged and was fortunate enough to be plucked out there and then see a different world and build a life for myself. And now coming back and saying, how do we build a country and give other people the opportunity this time to do it inside Zimbabwe.
Mr. Chapman, I've got 3 questions I'm going to ask you, and I'd like your responses to be as concise as possible. And the first one speaks to your manifesto and what it is that you're offering the people of Zimbabwe. Currently, what the people of Zimbabwe have experienced are many or proposed suggested alternatives to the current president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and the Zanu-PF party. But there is nothing tangible to what it is that they're offering. What are you offering the people of Zimbabwe should you be elected president?
That's a great question as well. Out of the top primary candidates, I would say that we're the only ones that have not have been in government, whether it's at local level or at national level. So it's a little bit different for us than the other candidates or other parties that have participated in this election because they do run council, they do run communities, they are leaders elected, whether it's in parliament or at the national level. Mm-hmm. So for us, the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe is running on 3 pillars. Prosperity, which we just touched on, justice. We need a free and fair and just system in Zimbabwe, which we don't have today. Our judiciary is very, very important to many aspects when it comes to addressing issues such as prosperity and citizens' protections. And the third one is modernization, is being able to build the country back up. We're not talking big, fancy stuff, but just basic infrastructure that allows the country to start progressing and moving in the right direction. So those are the 3 things that we're offering the country right now, is prosperity, justice, and modernization.
One of the country's biggest challenges has been engagement with the international community. Certainly, support to the country, some have called it sanctions, have been imposed on the country for over 2 decades. What's your plan on re-engagement of the international community and getting those sanctions lifted?
That's a great question, and I'm going to try and answer that as short as possible because that is we could spend an hour just talking about that alone. The first thing we need to do is we need to introspect is what is our domestic policy? Are we respecting human rights? Does our judicial system, is it free? Is it fair? Is it just? Are we applying the right sentences to the right crimes? Are we making sure that, there's child protection? We're making sure citizens are protected, peace and reconciliation in the country, and making sure there's, the political dialogue is free, and in fact, opening up even, access to freedom of speech and freedom of press. So the first thing we need to do is introspect as a nation and say, are we doing the right things to the measure of what's best for our culture and what's best for our country to progress and become more unified? At that point, as we're now running a parallel path and engage the international community, we want to find people that align themselves with our process and our cultures. So that process, at first, when it comes to looking at the economic sanctions that exist, Zimbabwe is rich in its natural resources. There are things that they want from Zimbabwe, and it creates an opportunity for us to negotiate or bypass. But I'll tell you this, and for us as Africans and being in Southern Africa, the African continent, the AU and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is probably one of the best opportunities for Zimbabwe to engage internationally first. Are we good with our neighbors? Do we understand our neighbors right there on the continent? And can we first trade amongst ourselves? And the small wins start to accumulate, and then we start looking at the bigger picture at the international level. But the first thing we have to do is we have to get our home in our own house straight first.
I am absolutely pressed for time, but I have to ask this. If you do not win the harmonized elections of 2023, are you prepared to work with the winning party?
Absolutely. This goal in being able to run in politics, and this is not just a one-stop and I'm done in 2023. My goal is to commit to building Zimbabwe for whatever time frame that takes. This is why it's important that we should be going into free and fair elections. Unfortunately, a lot of issues are being contested: the delimitation report, access to the voters' roll, the ability to campaign for political parties or opposition political parties, making sure that the violence and the rhetoric comes down so we're having the right message. So that way, when we do come out of the elections, we want to make sure we spend more time building the country going to the next 5 years of the election instead of contesting the elections. So my goal is, yes, I'm happy to work with whatever government goes in at that time, if it's not us, and making sure that we're doing the right things that build our country and still focusing on those three things, which is, prosperity, justice, and modernization. So the answer is yes, I'm loyal to my country.
Robert Chapman, appreciate your time on Africa Today. And he's one of those parties contesting in the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe. President, appreciate your time.